Let's bring back our guest from last week, Michael Rose. Michael and I had a long talk about his career and the bands he played with, and we started our second conversation about his recordings.
The recordings, all of the recordings that I have done are really the original arrangements of all of the big band songs in the big band era, so that when we performed these arrangements live, the people who had the original records, for example, or knew that material, would hear note for note, including the solos, a live performance of that. And that was my intent. But for the most part, I would say 90% of what we do are just actual recreations of the original record.
Did you come up with those arrangements, or did you just listen to the music and develop them?
No, I came up with the arrangement. I didn't arrange it. I had a good friend who I knew when I was back in high school, as a matter of fact, who came to Florida prior to the time that I started my band in Florida. He came to Florida to be an arranger for the Jackie Gleason show. And when I got to Florida, I heard his name, Bob Friedlander, and I said, is that the same Bob Friedlander that I knew back on Long Island? He said, yes. So I contacted him, and I said, Bob, I started a band, and I'd like you to write some arrangements for me. Now, Bob was a genius. He had perfect pitch. And he said, and I said, but I can't, I can't afford very much in terms of just starting a band, and I don't have the resources. And he said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do, Mike. He said, I won't write a score for you. He said, I can take a recorded copy of anything that you want. He said, and just write out the parts and give you the parts. He said, but I would suggest that you make duplications of those parts, because if they're lost, I don't have a score that you can go back to. So, and he said, I'll do it for you economically. So we did it kind of piece by piece, one at a time, and he started with my theme song, which was Unforgettable, which was an adaptation of Nat King Cole's original recording in 1943, as a matter of fact. It just so happened I started my band in Florida in 1990, and I think in 1991 or 92, Natalie Cole came back with the original duet hit. Mm-hmm. And so I was in business. I already had that as my theme song.
Michael Rose is my guest, and he talks about the start of his career with the help of Marshall Brown.
My career was inspired, encouraged, and guided by my mentor, who was Marshall Brown, a high school band director. And he was later noted in Leonard Feather's book of Encyclopedia of Jazz as the first high school jazz band in public education to perform at the Newport Jazz Festival. That story came about by the fact that when I was in high school playing with his jazz band, I graduated in 1954, but I was so excited about the band that I went and took a postgraduate course in high school, which was, I think, an unusual thing at the time to do, just to continue playing with the band. In that year, which was 1955, we decided to record an album and went into New York to Coral Records, which was a subsidiary of Columbia Records at the time, and recorded a full album.
The Newport Youth Band with its The Talk of the Town. Once again, Michael Rose.
The band got a lot of attention, and the band, when I was with it, we were on the Entertainment Tonight show, television with Tom Poston, the Today Show, and it was after I graduated that my mentor, Marshall, said to me, he said, "Mike," he said, "come live with me." He said, "You can continue your practicing." I started studying with the second trumpet player from the New York Philharmonic, Frank Venezia. I studied with Louis Mucci, who was playing lead trumpet on the Ed Sullivan Show, was on staff at the time. And then following that, they decided, let's have a band in the United States, a youth band for the Newport, called the Newport Youth Band, which was made up of musicians from 12 to 18 years old, comprised of the three states. It was Tri-State band from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And we put that band together, and I helped him with that. In the meantime, I was practicing and studying in New York and living with him in his apartment, which was kind of exciting because he was in charge with a lot of things in the business. He was now a well-known, educated, and respected. He was a former Army band musician himself during World War II, and he had the experiences of playing with other bands like Vaughn Monroe, for example. He and Vaughn Monroe came from Framingham, Massachusetts, and there was some kind of a connection there. In any case, I would be living with him and going through the day, spending the entire day with him. We would work during the day. He would receive phone calls from people like Benny Goodman and various other people, which always lit my fire because I was always excited about the contacts that he knew. And then in the evening, we would go to places like Birdland and catch the Count Basie Orchestra, or go to Basin Street East and see Lionel Hampton or Woody Herman or whoever was in town.
Let's bring back our guest, Michael Rose, and Michael talks about the auditions he got while living with his mentor, Marshall Brown.
During this time, he was also arranging auditions for me to go out and play. A couple of the auditions that he arranged for me, one time was with Buddy Morrow, who had a big hit on Night Train and had the band out, was popular, and I went to Connecticut with the band, auditioned. I came back. I didn't make the band, not necessarily because of the audition, but I found out later that he hired a trumpet player who also sang. And there's a story with that. Many, many, many years later, I'm playing a club date at the Biltmore Hotel, and one of the people on the club date was a Christmas party. It was Buddy Morrow, and Buddy Morrow was standing right next to me. It was myself, Buddy Morrow, and a saxophone player in the rhythm section, and a vocalist. And we were playing, and the leader said, "Let's play White Christmas." And because it was a Christmas party, and I played the first chorus, and after finishing that chorus, Buddy turned to me and he said, boy, he said, I don't hear trumpet players with a sound like that anymore. And I said, buddy, I wish you said that 17 years ago. He said, what was 17 years ago? I said, I auditioned for you in Connecticut, and you turned me down. So we had a big laugh.
Buddy Morrow with Night Train. Another audition for Michael Rose was with a legend from the big band era.
One day he said, Mike, he said, go to NOLA Studios. He said, there's an audition for a band that's going to be opening at Atlantic City for a 2-week engagement. And so I went to NOLA Studios, made the audition, and the band just happened to be Gene Krupa. When I came back, I didn't know that I made the audition. When I came back to the Marshall studio, he said, Mike, he said, you got the gig. I said, he did. I said, they didn't let me know. He said, no, I just got the call. You got the gig. So I went to Atlantic City with Gene Krupa. The interesting thing is that when I got to Atlantic City, the manager of the band said, I want everybody to meet tomorrow morning in the lobby at 10 a.m. And I thought, well, this is interesting. We met at 10 a.m. Gene gave us some T-shirts that said the Gene Krupa All-Stars, and we went on to play the Atlantic City Fire Department in baseball.
Okay.
Gene was a baseball nut, and he pitched. As a matter of fact, we won 13-2, and that was my first experience with Gene before we got onto the bandstand.
Oh, really? Really?
Absolutely. The engagement at the Steel Pier, which was twofold for me. I had never been there before. I always heard about the $1 Million Ballroom at the Steel Pier, and there I was, sitting right next to Gene Krupa, and it was the absolute thrill of my lifetime. time to time when Gene put together a band, I worked with him. As a matter of fact, that was in like 1958, and somewhere in the 70s, I was still working with him. We had 3 summer concerts to do out on Long Island, and which were 1 month apart. They were a park mall, as a matter of fact, concerts. And Gene made the first 2, and the third he missed because he was ill, and then he never played after that. So I worked with him for my entire lifetime until he passed. But it was a really great experience. He was a great guy.
Michael Rose remembers playing with the Jimmy Palmer Band.
I took another audition, and I joined the society band of Jimmy Palmer, who was a territory band from Chicago. And I joined the band, and I was playing trumpet. I was playing third trumpet, and I was playing also valve trombone. And I didn't really particularly care to play valve trombone because there were 2 different embouchure settings, and I didn't want to spoil my trumpet setting, which I thought it was spoiling for a while, but it was just uncomfortable. It didn't really spoil it, but it was uncomfortable. Jimmy said to me, he said, "Mike, I'm going out on the road." He said, "I'd like you to come with me." There was an interesting story about a park in Elitch Gardens in Colorado. We were playing at Elitch, and during our concert, Jimmy said to the trumpet section, "Anybody back there know Sugar Blues?" And I said, "I do." He said, "Come on up front and play it." I took my wah-wah mute and said to the rhythm section, we didn't have an arrangement, I said to the rhythm section, the key of C, give me an introduction. They gave me an introduction of 4 measures, and I went up and playing at the microphone the recorded version of Clyde McCoy's Sugar Blues, which I had learned, as a matter of fact, prior to that on playing club dates because it was a popular tune at the time. As I was playing it, I was looking out in the audience, and some people were dancing, and there was always an amount of people who were assembled kind of at the side of the bandstand looking up at the band performing. And I noticed a man in a hat. He was looking at the band with some interest. When we finished playing the song, Jimmy turned to the audience and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Michael Rose and the famous Clyde McCoy Sugar Blues. And ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Clyde McCoy, who is standing right there." And I said, "What?" I was playing that. He was really gracious. He came back to the bandstand. We were finishing the set, as a matter of fact. Came back to the bandstand and said, "Boy," he said, "I wish I would have played it that well on the record." Well, he was being kind because he played it very well on his record. But I thought of that when I heard your program when you played the Sugar Blues.
Michael Rose will be back next hour on BBS with memories of Henry Cuesta, Margaret Whiting, and Les Algart.
When I was on the road with Jimmy, it was an interesting experience because when we played our hotel venues, for example, when we were in the Chase Hotel in St. Louis, we worked with Carol Channing, who had just finished her sensational run with Hello Dolly. We worked with J.P. Morgan of The Gong Show fame, who had a big hit at the time called Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries. And at the Hotel Roosevelt in New Orleans, we worked with various comics, Shelley Berman, Joey Lewis, the comic who headed the headlined at the Copacabana in New York City. Actresses Dorothy Lamour, Linda Darnell. I worked with opposite the Dukes of Dixieland. He had Barrett Deems they had Barrett Deems as their drummer, who was also Louis Armstrong's drummer, and also a clarinet player by the name of Henry Cuesta, who went on to play with the Lawrence Welk Show. And the interesting thing is that I was rooming next to Barrett Deems in our hotel and Henry Cuesta, and Barrett Deems said he had just turned down Lawrence Welk because he didn't want to play that kind of music. And Henry had said, boy, he said, I wish I had an opportunity to play with that. And a few years later, I was watching television, and there was Henry, who was a senior member of that band.
Henry Cuesta with St. Louis Blues. My guest is Michael Rose.
I also worked with Margaret Whiting, who was an absolute delight. This was at a later time when I was with Jimmy. This was maybe the second or third time that we were at the Hotel Roosevelt in New Orleans, and I was newly married, and my wife, who had just finished her bachelor's degree, and Jimmy Palmer's wife, who was in New York at the time, both decided they were going to come down to New Orleans, see our show with Margaret Whiting, and there was a maitre d' at the hotel who was kind of a no-nonsense kind of guy. And in the lobby, we met with some confrontation with the maitre d' who said, I can't do this at this late date. There are no tables available, that kind of thing. And Margaret Whiting was just coming down to make her appearance because we were about to go on in a few minutes. And she heard this little confrontation. She said, what's the problem? And I said, Jimmy's wife is here, and my wife is here. And I said, and the maitre d' won't seat them. Well, a table was brought in up in front of the bandstand at Margaret's expense. And she said to the maitre d', I want these people at our dinner show for every night that I'm playing here for the rest of my engagement. And we had about 4 days left, and in fact they were there. So it was very nice. Years later, I was living in Palm Beach, and we went to see Margaret Whiting at the Colony Hotel. And I said to Margaret, do you remember when I was working with you in New Orleans? And I said, and you interceded on behalf of Jimmy's wife and my. She said, yes, the Jimmy Palmer Band. I remember that very well.
Wow.
And it was really. And we said that was very kind of you.
Now back to our guest, Michael Rose. Michael tells us why he left the Jimmy Palmer Band.
Jimmy at the time said, I'm going to go back on the road. I've got some dates in Texas and that kind of thing. And I was newly married, so I said, Jim, I'm not going to make this. And I was playing lead trumpet at this time because one of the stipulation I originally made with him is that I'll come out on the road with you, but I want to play lead trumpet. I don't want to play valve trombone any longer. And he agreed to that. And as far as he was concerned, I was his best lead trumpet player at this time, so he wasn't too happy with the fact that I was going to leave. And so I stayed in New York. My wife got a job at Columbia Records. And I started to work with other bands, Lester Lannon Band for one. And at that time, I joined the Les Algart Band. I went to the Union, and I knew a trumpet player there, and he said, Mike, he said, I've got some dates with Les. He said, do you want to come out with the band? I said, what are you doing? He said, I think we had 6 dates. We're going to open up a new nightclub in Knoxville, Tennessee. We had a date at University of Pennsylvania. We had a date in William and Mary College, and so I went out with the band, and it was a wonderful experience. I enjoyed it.
Les and Larry Algard with Song of India. Michael Rose is my guest.
I went with the Jimmy Dorsey Orchestra. Now, this was a ghost band. Jimmy was no longer leading the band. It was Lee Castle, his former trumpet player, who was leading the band. And I went out with the band. We stayed in the tri-state area, and we did about 2 weeks of dates in theaters and high schools and auditoriums. And it was a wonderful experience, because not only did we play the Jimmy Dorsey Library, but we featured Billy Eckstine. Henny Youngman was the comedian, and Charlie Ventura was featured. I started, getting excited about the business because I was working with all these people, and I was, really enjoying myself.
Here is the Jimmy Dorsey Orchestra under the direction of Lee Castle. After playing with numerous bands, Michael Rose decided on a change.
I started my own rehearsal band in New York City at my mentor's rehearsal studio. He had one on 72nd Street in New York. While I was rehearsing my band, my wife was working at Columbia Records, and she encouraged one of the A&R men, Al Kashib, to come down and listen to the band. Well, he came down and listened to the band, and he got a little excited. He said, could we do this? He said, could we get some pop tunes of the day? I think Personality was a pop tune of the day. He said, and record them with the big band sound. He said, that might appeal to the rock generation. And I said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. He said, but we need an identifying sound. I said, well, I play trumpet. And he said, well, aside from that, he said, like a Glenn Miller sound. And I said, well, I'll tell you what. Glenn Miller used a lead clarinet instead of a lead alto to get his particular sound. I said, suppose we do this. Why don't we have, instead of a lead alto, a soprano sax? He said, that's a great idea. So he said, let's record some things. And he asked us to come up to Columbia Records, and we recorded 4 tracks. One of the tracks was Everybody's Somebody's Fool that Connie Francis had recorded, and 3 other tracks. One was Personality, and one was an original something Twisting the Blues. The twist was big at the time, and we were excited about that. As a matter of fact, the guys came out off of the record date and they said, "Mike, you got a hit with a couple of these things. This really makes it. There's nothing like it." And at the time, Columbia had just rid themselves of Benny Goodman, Harry James, Duke Ellington, because those weren't selling, and they wanted to get into the new market. Well, we were excited about that for a while, and finally, the A&R man took the recording to the executives at Columbia Records, and he said, I got a call, and they said, "Well, they're listening and deciding on your side as to whether to sign you, but there's somebody else they're also considering, but we'll get the response shortly." And sure enough, in about a week, he called me back and he said, "Mike," he said, "they didn't go for your band," and he said, "They said that they had a kid from Pennsylvania who not only plays all of the instruments but also sings, and so we're going to sign him." And that was Bobby Vinton. So I lost out to Bobby Vinton.
Yeah, and he led a big band too at the very beginning.
Yes, I know. That was it. That was my competition. And in fact, that he sang. So they said we were out in left field.
Thanks to Michael Rose for being with us, and Michael will be back next week. Thanks to Michael Rose, Bobby Vinton, and Ray Anthony. Next week, Michael Rose will be back, and Lisa Kelly will join us. Lisa used to sing with the Larry Elgart Band. Her father, Franklin Warner, was on our show recently, and he played with the Harmonicats. Be sure to follow us on Facebook for stations, days, and times. And until we meet again, I'm Jim Stone. Thanks for listening.